Hi there, this is Erica Merrill, and I am the founder of Perfect Legal Video. I am very excited to bring to you today our very first criminal interview. We're going to be talking about roadside tests, and I know that they're called different things in different states. Field sobriety tests are the common term for it. And today we'll be talking to attorney Brian Jones about this topic and the do's and the don'ts and the nitty gritty and all of that. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Brian.
Hello, Erica. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks so much for joining us. I guess the first question is, and I know you get this a lot, you get pulled over. It's your worst possible nightmare. These people absolutely don't expect to ever be arrested or in this type of hot water. The question is, should they do a field sobriety test?
Well, you're right. Most people don't expect to be arrested, and it doesn't take a person to be guilty to be pulled over and accused. Anybody can be pulled over and accused. The reality about field sobriety tests is that there's no law requiring you to take them. And if an officer is asking you to take field sobriety tests, he or she is probably, at least in large part, made up their mind that they think that you're driving drunk and they are gathering evidence in order to attempt to convict you of a DUI.
Well, that's a scary thought because, it should be that you are innocent until proven guilty, but it sounds like they've made up their mind. In a lot of cases, which I guess, it makes sense that the scales might tip in that direction for that person that's pulling you over. What would typically happen in a field sobriety test?
So there are three standardized roadside field sobriety tests: the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, also known as the HGN, the one-legged stand, and the walk and turn test, which most people think about as, you walk the line. In the HGN, the officer waves a pen or a light in front of your eyes and is looking to see what's called nystagmus, and it refers to an involuntary jerking of the eyes. So the eyes bounce back and forth, and you'll often see officers or people who talk about this test and they'll wave their hand like this. But the reality of that jerking, that involuntary jerking, is that it's much more subtle.
Wow. You freezed up a little.
Formed on them doesn't know that it's happening. And the jerking, that is. And the officer has to be paying very, very close attention to identify the nystagmus. The walk and turn test, as another example, has 29 individual instructions from start to finish that a person has to remember and execute perfectly. For the walk and turn test, if you miss any more than 3 of those individual instructions, you are considered to have failed the test. And I don't know about you, Erica, but I've never taken a test where getting a 93% is a failing score.
Oh man, no, I haven't either. I'd pray for that kind of failure.
Right, most people would be very happy with getting over 90% of questions or tasks assigned to them correct, but that's not good enough for a roadside field sobriety test. And likewise for the one-legged stand. There are multiple individual commands that an individual has to follow in order to quote unquote pass that test. But again, exhibiting even 1 or 2 clues, an officer could say, well, maybe they didn't necessarily fail that, but it's an indication of intoxication. And the funny thing about these clues, especially with regards to the one-legged stand and the walk and turn test is that these clues that they're looking for start even before you begin the physical dexterity aspect of the test. The officer will put you in what he refers to as the starting position. And if you move from that position, just standing like a normal person, listening to another person talk to you and give you instructions, that's considered a clue that you have you're intoxicated.
Wow. That doesn't seem right.
It doesn't seem fair, does it? Because you're not told that that's a clue beforehand. That's the other thing that's really, I think, unfair about these tests is you're not told how the test is going to be graded. You're not told what the correct process is in the test before you take the test. And I've never taken a test where I didn't know, or at least at some point during the class have received what the material on the test was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, all right, so you're already stressed out. You're in the situation you've never thought you'd be in, and now somebody's giving you a test that you possibly can't even pass. And I've heard, and I know this isn't one of your common questions, but there's a lot of factors where somebody would fail the test and it wouldn't even be their fault, such as like the walk and turn. You know, maybe they're overweight or they don't have arches, or I don't know. I mean, I know that you deal with this every single day, but these are just like a few of the things that I've heard.
Yeah. So with regards to the eye test, the HGN test, some people have what's called resting nystagmus. They just have nystagmus. External stimulation, such as cars driving by, flashing lights is the standard, can cause nystagmus. Your eye could just jerk to a location past the officer, and the officer could consider that refocusing nystagmus. Concussions can cause nystagmus. So if you've been in a traffic accident, that's a frequent trigger for officers to start investigating for a driving situation. But if you've been in a traffic accident, we all know how susceptible humans are to concussions from the NFL, from soccer even. You know, people can literally get a concussion from getting hit in the head by a soccer ball. So if that light of an impact can cause a concussion, you know, obviously a car accident can also. You hit the nail on the head with obesity, can make the walk and turn and the one-legged stand invalid. But officers very frequently ignore those factors when grading these tests and consider the tests failed tests and use them as support to make an arrest decision.
And what about women who are wearing heels at the time? I mean, I personally probably look drunk every time I wear heels because I am terrible at it. But I can't imagine somebody judging me trying to do a 9-step walk and turn while wearing heels. They're just not that easy to walk in.
Sure, and Erica, I also can't walk in heels for what it's worth. But staying in January, in the rain, on the side of the highway, which, you know, it's a choice without a real choice. So you can perform this test with pebbles jamming into your toes, you know, poking your heels, or you can attempt to walk heel to toe in a situation where you've got a 1 centimeter square peg on which to connect your toe to your quote unquote heel.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, a lot of times if you're walking on the side of the road, you know, those heels will sink right into the dirt. And, you know, like you said, if it's raining, if there's any other, like where I'm from, there's a lot of inclement weather certain times of year. And I can just see where it would be scary. And like you mentioned, like even having all the traffic passing at night, it's, you know, it can be dizzying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The traffic can be distracting. You know, the weather conditions and the mere fact of nervousness. So what these tests grade is cognitive ability, the memorization of the multi-part test, examination, gross motor skills and fine motor skills, because these are the things that alcohol does affect in the central nervous system. This is not to say that alcohol doesn't affect your ability to drive. Absolutely it does. And properly enforced OVI laws are very important to the safety of everybody out on the road. But we need to enforce those laws fairly. Mere nervousness is absolutely going to affect your fine motor skills and gross motor skills as well. Anybody who's an athlete, who's ever competed in a major championship or a very important sporting event knows the pregame jitters, the shaking that you get from that rush of adrenaline. And I don't know about you, Erica, but I've been pulled over once or twice in my life for nothing more than speeding. And even as an attorney, even as a defense attorney with over 12 years of experience, my heart starts to race. My hands start to get sweaty. So, I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm experienced. I know the games and the tricks that are going to be pulled on me. But it's still a harrowing experience, even for somebody as experienced as me. So the average citizen doesn't stand a chance when the officer gets them out of the car.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when you look at it, it's like, well, just like attorneys. I married an attorney, and look, I never actually interacted with attorneys for most of my life. And so I would not know what to expect with attorneys, but it's the same thing with law enforcement. I mean, how many cops do you happen to know? It's unless you have a family member or you work in an industry that interacts, you probably haven't had a lot of interactions, and people have that stigma, and it whether it's true or not, they watch a lot of movies and they see things on TV and they hear what happened with their neighbors, whatever. And so they've got that at the back of their mind. Whether it's true or not, it makes you more nervous, I think.
Absolutely. And those nerves are never taken into account when they get into court.
Yeah, you feel like you're in trouble, even though you may or may not have done something wrong. You're just going to feel that way either way.
Yeah.
So if they know that there's all these situations where things can go wrong, I mean, they've all, the cops do go to the courtroom and they see what the defense is, and things get thrown out, and some of the results of these tests. Why do they continue doing this test?
Well, the reality is they've been using these tests for decades. These tests were originally validated back in the 1970s and 80s. They've not been updated since then. And there's not been any attempt to make a more accurate test in the meantime. That being said, these tests, when performed properly, when graded properly, do give a fairly accurate indication as to whether somebody's impaired or not. And at that point in the process, on the roadside, the officer only has to come up with probable cause, a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed and a particular individual has committed that crime. So they're not looking to I guess the standard, more accurately, isn't to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, but to trigger the next step in the process, which is citation and then potentially taking a chemical test.
Wow. Now, when they do the tests, I know you've given me some hints since we've started this interview, but what exactly are they looking for? I mean, I know that you said they are looking for you to mess up on all of these crazy long lists of rules that you have to abide by. And can you tell me just what have we missed from what we've talked about already?
So the officers in the horizontal gaze nystagmus test are looking for that involuntary jerking. Now, the funny thing about that test is it's the only one that we can't observe on cruiser video. And with the advent of body-worn cameras, I've seen a small handful of situations where I've been able to view the material the officer is grading on the body-worn camera. But that's when the officer is honestly standing too close to the subject to properly perform the test. So even then, even even in a body cam situation, they're often too far away for anybody other than the officer to see if that clue is really there. With the walk and turn, they're looking to see if the subject has followed instructions. As I said earlier, stepping off, stepping out of the starting position, separating the heel and the toe during the walking process. And that is a very subjective determination. What the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says is that separation has to be in excess of a quarter of an inch. But that's that's a small distance. And oftentimes smaller distances than even that are graded as failures. There's a very specific way that the officer will instruct the subject on how to turn after the 9th step. And if you don't turn in that precise manner, they consider that a clue. And then moving on to the one-legged stand, they're looking for things like raising the arms, and what the NHTSA says is more than 6 inches. So you're supposed to keep your hands to your sides while you're standing on one leg, which is a wildly unnatural position to assume in the first place. But then if your hands move away from your body, or you just stand in a more natural position with your hands swinging to your sides, I have seen officers consider that the more than 6 inches. Obviously with the one-legged stand, if you put your foot down, that's a clue. Or if you're hopping around on one leg, that's a clue. But again, this is a balance and coordination test. And if you're uncoordinated or imbalanced just as naturally as a person, you're going to fail these tests.
Oh my God. I mean, I would be really embarrassed if anyone ever saw me attempt yoga. I am terrible. Even with the tree position, you put your arm, I am terrible. And I could not pass any of those tests, sober or like any other way. And I'm sure that there's lots of other people out like that.
Yeah. Well, and Erica, it's not just regular people like you and me. I feel your pain on the yoga positions as well, but I've represented athletes all the way from high school athletes, collegiate athletes, professional athletes, who I have seen attempt to perform these tests. And even though they have the highest level of athletic prowess, these are not things that they have done before. And that's the real catch with asking people to perform these field sobriety tests. The officers want courts and ultimately juries to believe that these are very simple tasks. Well, for the officer, it is a very simple task. If you've performed it hundreds of times over the course of your career, you could absolutely do it. If you practice it long enough, you're going to be good at it. But the people that are getting pulled over on the side of the road have very rarely in their lives walked an absolutely straight line. And even fewer times have they walked that absolutely straight line in a heel to toe manner with their hands plastered against their thighs. It's a very unnatural thing. And unless you've practiced it, you're going to be poor at it.
Wow. I mean, those are all very good points. I mean, you hear them talking about training football people by having them take ballet and that sort of thing, because they aren't good at some of that flexibility and that balance. And I mean, it's the cross training that they possibly don't have. So, I mean, those are very good points. And plus, some of those people are pretty big and heavy people. Even if you're not fat, if you're a heavy person, like trying to stand on one leg, whether it's muscle or fat, is going to be, really kind of tough, I would think. Is it possible that people can ever pass these tests?
Sure. Yeah, you can get lucky and pass these tests. But should you risk your freedom on that off chance? And I would say no. I would say that if the officer has a good reason to arrest you, he or she is going to have that good reason to arrest you, whether you've done these tests or not. And I don't see any reason to give them inaccurate, rigged results in an attempt to increase their conviction numbers.
So those are all great points. What happens, and when in the most likely case, you take one of these tests and you fail because you fail with an A grade. What happens next?
More often than not, the next step is arrest. So you'll be handcuffed, searched, and put in the cruiser. Your car will be impounded, and we all know how well tow truck companies take care of our vehicles. You'll be taken to a police station and asked to submit to a chemical test.
I know this is not one of the questions on there, but like, what happens if you have something in your car alive, like, an animal or your kid? What do they typically do?
So if it's an animal, that could be a wide range of potential outcomes. I had a client about 8 months ago who was traveling with her dog. And during the course of the stop, the officer let the dog out of the vehicle, and the dog ran away for a significant period of time. The dog was scared and fled the location. The officer didn't chase the dog down, didn't call for anybody to chase the dog down. And my client had a very difficult time with that situation. Fortunately, she was close enough to home, and the dog knew the way home. So a neighbor was able to take the dog in for the evening, but the officer had no regard for that animal's safety. Children will have a loved one called on their behalf to come and pick them up. But if nobody can, then Children's Services will be called, and they could be temporarily put in foster care.
Oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. Especially since you're getting pulled over on the side of a highway a lot of times. Animals could just get out and get run over if they're scared and they're not looking where they're going. And for the kids, oh my gosh, that's a really scary situation to be all of a sudden hauled off with strangers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean that's really it's really interesting. So I guess my last question is, I mean, we're talking about something very specific, and there's a lot of different aspects with, drunk driving and the whole process from booking, from when they pull you over. I mean, I guess one question I had for you, one time I pulled over a long time ago. I think I was 20 years old, but I felt like the cop got behind me and sped up behind me to make me go faster. And then I got pulled over. I don't know. Does that ever happen? Or like, I know I was 21 or something when that happened, but I'm just curious. I wasn't drinking at all, and I had my sister in the car, so it wasn't a big deal. But he cited me for speeding.
Yeah. So, if an officer identifies an individual that they intend to pull over, they frequently have to catch up to that person, which means very fast acceleration, oftentimes weaving in and out of traffic. And that can make a driver nervous, seeing a vehicle that you don't know that that's a police officer as they're flying up behind you. And a natural reaction is to speed up. Now, I would say for you and all of our listeners, it's not the right reaction. If you see any car coming up to you, at an unsafe rate of speed, the safe thing would be to pull over and let that vehicle go by you. But absolutely, I've seen cruiser videos where law enforcement officers tailgate the suspect, get within a matter of feet of the suspect, drive beside the suspect, and kind of move over slowly into that lane. A variety of situations where, with our strict liability laws regarding traffic offenses, any innocent mistake can result in a citation. And that's what the officer needs to pull you over, is he's got to see one of those violations. just for making a poor choice in reaction to a situation that even the officer created. It's certainly not fair, but it is going to hold up in court if you commit that violation. So, should you find yourself in that position in the future, I would absolutely advocate turning on your turn signal, safely pulling over to the side of the road. And if the officer comes up to your window and says, "Why'd you pull over?" then you can very honestly say, "I didn't feel comfortable with the vehicle that was behind me. Now I know that it's a law enforcement officer, but the rate of speed at which it closed on my bumper, I thought that might be a reckless driver who was going to run me off the road."
And that would be an honest answer. And all the points that you made are very well taken. I mean, unfortunately, that's kind of what they have to do to catch up, like you said. But like I know, and this may seem, I don't know how it seems to people, but I'm a woman, and a lot of times we are, there's just some sketchy things that happen out there. There's trafficking, and there's people that have ill intentions, and scaring you into pulling over, and then bad things happen. So I mean, that's unfortunately in the back of my mind. When stuff happens, I'm always like on the lookout for something bad that happens, even walking to my car and all that. So I mean, for some people, it might be someone that it just has like a red flag goes up, and they want to avoid the situation, as opposed to kind of looking to see if it's somebody that's just trying to help out, or trying to make sure that everything's okay, and that you're abiding by the law. I mean, I don't know how often that happens, but that's something that I experienced recently, just with somebody rear-ending me while I was driving on the highway. And I don't know why that was happening, and what had nothing to do with law enforcement, but it was scary nonetheless.
Yeah, and there's some ways that people can protect themselves if that's a concern that they have. One is you are absolutely entitled to record law enforcement. So even if it is law enforcement, you can turn on your cell phone. Most vehicles have a cup holder, and you can kind of prop your cell phone up there in the cup holder so that the camera is facing out of your window and captures both you and the officer. And if you feel unsafe, you can always call, demand that the officer call for backup. If you think the officer is behaving inappropriately, asking for inappropriate things, then you've got your video recording, and you can ask for another officer. Another option, and you can't evade the police, even in a low-speed chase. What you can do is travel to a safe location. So identifying things like banks, gas stations, some public place where there are additional eyes around to make sure that nothing untoward happens.
I mean, I think that's great. I know it's a little off topic, but I mean, there are lots of things that happen out there on the highway, and sometimes things are incorporated. So that's good to know. And I personally should have called 911 probably when that happened, just to say, hey, I don't know what's going on with this guy. He's reckless driving. But I can see where it could happen in the course of a chasing somebody down. Because like you said, people do get nervous.
And in that situation, you should absolutely, put on your hazard flashers, proceed at a very slow pace to let the officer know that you're not fleeing. You're just going to a well-lit, populated area. And that's a very real concern here in Central Ohio. There was an officer that I believe was very recently sentenced, or at a minimum has a criminal case pending for pulling over women, sexually assaulting them, in exchange for letting them out of whatever he intended to accuse them of. So a very real concern in this day and age, even with body-worn cameras, even with cruiser cameras, those recording devices are always in the control of the officer. And the dishonest officer is the one that's going to turn those recordings off, or potentially mute the audio recording on a video recording device. And those switches, they're very easy for the officers to manipulate. And unfortunately, there's a small number of bad apples that will take advantage of that and take advantage of their authority position.
Yeah, it's such a small percentage too, and it's definitely too bad when that happens. But I'm really glad that you've got some good tips for people, just in case they do feel uncomfortable. That they may or may not have reason to be, but they want to err on the side of caution, as opposed to take a risk and then feel sorry that something really terrible happened. So
Well,
those are
and
really good
so
tips.
without getting themselves in additional trouble too.
Right. So that's really good. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of really interesting topics. Those are the questions I have for today. If there are any stories that you want to share or any other facts that we didn't cover today, let me know, and love to hear it.
Well, I'll share one story with you, just to wrap things up. Recent case that we had where an athletic individual pulled over. He was speeding, no marked lanes violations, no weaving, just speeding in the wrong area. And he was pulled over on a ramp, on an entrance ramp to the highway. And the officer forced him to perform field sobriety tests. And in particular, the ones we're looking at are the standing on one leg and walking the line on a sloped surface. So
Yeah.
part of our investigation in the case, we went out to that entrance ramp. We took a level with us. We took our iPhones with us that have a level built into them. And we were able to create evidence to prove that ramp is sloped 5 degrees, one way to the other. And wouldn't you know it, the errors that he made, when he stepped off of the line as he's doing the walk and turn, he steps off down slope. And when he kind of sways for balance while he's doing the one-legged stand, guess which way he falls? Downhill. So, that's just one story of how the officers know better than that. There are a variety of options available to them that it may make a traffic stop take longer. It may be an inconvenience to the officer in the moment, but the officer disregarded doing a proper investigation in order to get this catch, get him back to the station, and get back out there to get the next one.
Exactly. Now, I mean, there's one point I do like to cover before we go on this, and that is just something like this happens to you. You can probably try your luck in court on your own, but I mean, what can an attorney do for you?
Well, attorneys who are experienced DUI attorneys have, at a minimum, read the National Traffic Highway Safety Administration manual on the administration and grading of field sobriety tests. At a more appropriate level, they've gone to seminars and been through training on how those tests should be administered and for identifying what to look for in those tests. Challenging the field sobriety tests in a motion to suppress is often the most critical stage of any DUI case. If the officer doesn't have those field sobriety tests to rely on in making a probable cause decision, then the entirety of the case can be thrown out, ultimately forced to be thrown out by the prosecutor. And Ohio judges don't have the power to necessarily dismiss cases on those grounds, but they can limit the evidence so far that the prosecutor doesn't have a case to put on. So having an experienced DUI attorney gives you the best chance of knocking out those field sobriety tests because of the unfairness of the tests, because of the unfairness of the grading of the tests, or because of the personal particularities of the individual being subjected to the tests. And once you eliminate those, the rest of the prosecution's case can very quickly unravel, resulting in very good results.
And I think that's great. And it just makes sense to use an attorney because you guys are in court every single day and you see all of the different situations that happen. You see the outcomes and you see the strategies that work and some of the strategies that don't. And it's not just about like trying to go in and win something that should have gone the other way. It's really about abiding by the law and making sure that everything is fair, and knowing exactly what to look for to make sure that it's fair, and that obviously you want to get the best outcome for your client, but you're not looking to necessarily let a bunch of drunk drivers out there that don't deserve to be out there driving. You're really trying to do what's in the best interest for everyone by following the law.
That's absolutely true, Erica. And I'll tell you this, we've talked about some bad apples in law enforcement, but being in court as much as I am, and being born and raised here in Delaware, I know a substantial number of law enforcement officers, both from my professional career and my personal life, just growing up here in town. And I will candidly tell any one of them, and obviously I'm going to say it here on the internet, if a law enforcement officer does their job, does it fairly, and does it properly, there's very little I can do to make charges go away. Honestly, there's nothing that I can do to make charges go away. The problem comes when corners are cut, when officers don't follow the rules and don't follow the law. And that's why we have courts, is to make sure that the proper standards are upheld. As I said earlier in our conversation, these field sobriety tests are standardized. There were peer-reviewed studies conducted to make sure that they were accurate, but they're only accurate when they're performed and graded in the manner prescribed in those tests. If you look at it in a little bit of a different way, if you go to your doctor and your doctor were to take your blood pressure, but instead of increasing the pressure in the cuff to the point where the pressure was high enough to actually measure your blood pressure, they just pumped that little ball twice. And so the needle doesn't go up high enough to actually get an accurate measure, but they say, well, yeah, your blood pressure is low enough for me. That's not an accurate test, and it's not a test that you would want to rely on, because you could be looking down the barrel of a heart attack or a stroke. If these tests aren't performed in the manner prescribed by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the national standard that did verification studies over and over again to make sure that they were accurate, then they're not accurate. These are scientific tests, and we should hold the officers to that scientific standard. It only takes a few more minutes, and it only takes a little bit of honesty. And most officers go that route. But do you really want to risk your freedom rolling the dice on that?
Yeah, and I think you've made so many good points. And and sometimes it's just like everyone else. We're all busy and we're trying to get things done. And maybe this happens at the end of their shift, and they're like, "Oh, I don't want to take another half hour to make sure this is done a certain way. Well, let's just fudge some of this." That could mean somebody's livelihood, because they lose their license, or they get thrown in jail and they can't make a paycheck for their family, or they lose their kids, or there's so many really, really bad things that can happen if things are not followed exactly the way they should be in the roadside tests and in other parts of the process with DUI arrests. So, these are all incredible points. And that's a really good analogy with the blood pressure. I haven't heard that before. I love it. So thanks for sharing that too.
It's all about stories, Erica.
It is. It's how you tell the story. And I think you tell a good story. And I think that you are a fantastic lawyer. So if you know someone, I'm talking to the audience, if you know somebody out there that has had the unfortunate situation of being arrested for, how do you say it in your state? Because we say DUI here.
DUI, OVI, operating a motor vehicle while impaired is what our legislature has decided to title it, but OVI or DUI.
Okay, good. So if anyone has had a problem with that, or someone with a problem, and it's just an unexpected thing that happened, definitely please give the Office of Brian Jones a call. They have a fantastic professional staff helping out. The attorneys are very knowledgeable and, really looking at your best interest, um, and they're there to help. So just give them a call. It's a free consultation, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I should have asked that before bringing it up, but usually it's a good phone call. They can give you some of your options, whether you use them or not. It's always good to talk to an attorney before you try to attempt anything in the court system, because things can go bad and it could ruin your entire life. So if there's any reason to get an attorney, with all the different attorneys out there, I'd say this is one of the most important reasons that you could get an attorney.
Absolutely. Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I'm so excited. This is our first interview. I think it went great. I was enthralled with the information, and I'm looking forward to next week when we tackle another issue in criminal law.
Excellent. I'll look forward to talking to you then, Erica. Have a great day.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a great day, Brian. Bye-bye.